Amateur Traveler, episode 859. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about carpets and a caravanserai, palaces and plav, mud volcanoes, and a flame temple as we go to Azerbaijan. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Azerbaijan. I'd like to welcome back to the show Emily Lush from wanderlush.org, who has come to talk to us today about Azerbaijan. Emily, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me back.
And I say back to the show, we did an episode 2 years ago talking about Western Georgia, which, if you haven't heard that, is a great episode, so go back and listen to that one. But Emily, you've gone to another place in the Caucasus today. What's your connection with Azerbaijan?
Yeah, so I live here in Georgia. I've been here for 3 years, and Azerbaijan is a neighboring country.
Georgia
the country. Yes, sorry, to be more specific. So yeah, Azerbaijan is a neighboring country, of course, and I've traveled there a couple of times. I first went there in 2017. And then recently I went back twice. I've been back twice this spring to just check it out, see how things are going. So yeah, the region is quite small, and Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan are three countries that people often visit at the same time. So I'm the same. I'm very interested in the entire region, and yeah, I love visiting and exploring all three of these countries.
And when you talk about Georgia, where you live, versus Azerbaijan, which is just over the border, they're quite different culturally.
Definitely. It's funny. There's the three countries. Armenia and Georgia are more similar, I would say. They're both Christian nations, Orthodox and Apostolic. Azerbaijan is like the odd one out in many ways. So it's an Islamic country to start with. It's quite a young nation, certainly compared to Georgia and Armenia. This idea of Azerbaijan is quite new compared to the other countries. And it's also got a different political system, and let's just put it that way. And it's quite a wealthy country in many ways. After the breakup, the three countries were both all in the Soviet Union, of course, and after that fell apart. Azerbaijan did quite well relatively because they, of course, have oil. So you think about the Central Asian countries on the other side of the Caspian. In some ways, Azerbaijan is similar to these countries. It's also like a Turkic. They have roots in Turkic history. So yeah, it's quite different. It's quite distinct from the other two, especially from Georgia.
And you said you wanted to say a little something about the political system or the political situation in Azerbaijan before we get started?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea just to point out that there is a conflict, there is a war going on that isn't always in the news, but between Azerbaijan and Armenia, it's been going on for a really long time, and it's a terrible situation. It's been going on since the 90s, but recently it's bubbled to the surface again, and I think it's important that people do their research and kind of know what they're getting into if they travel to these countries. Of course, it's fairly safe for tourists, certainly, but yeah, just from being aware of what's going on. So it centers around this disputed territory, which is not a place you would necessarily... You certainly wouldn't go there at the moment, and you don't really travel near there either. But yeah, it's just good to know that the current situation and what is happening in this region, I think it's really important for people to understand.
Excellent. And why should someone go to Azerbaijan, though? Who talked about the things you need to be careful about?
It's really fascinating from a cultural point of view, from a scenery and hiking. Being in the Caucasus, it's got those great mountain areas for hiking. It's a misunderstood country in a lot of ways. As I was saying, it's quite young, and it has this really interesting history with all different influences. And then the oil stuff, so maybe people know it's a wealthy country with really outlandish modern architecture, but then there's also quite a few UNESCO sites that are really very old and very interesting. It's a very complicated country with a little bit of everything, like this region. And certainly if you're coming to Georgia, coming to Armenia, it's really nice to do all three countries together. It gives you a really nice sort of overview of the region.
Excellent. What kind of itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
So I think like 7 to 10 days is perfect for Azerbaijan, and that's a good amount of time if you're doing all three countries as well. Just to mention as well that Azerbaijan still has COVID restrictions, so you can't travel in by land. That's the last thing they have in place, and I think this has been extended till October. So The official reason for that is COVID. So basically you have to fly in. So previously a lot of people would take the train from Tbilisi to Baku. That was a really nice way to travel. It's an overnight train. Unfortunately, you can't do that right now. You have to fly to Baku. So yeah, just to mention that sort of logistical thing that you have to take into consideration. But in a way, it's nice to start from Baku, from the capital, get your bearings there. And then I'm going to suggest traveling overland and traveling back into Georgia, because you can leave Azerbaijan by land and then come back into Georgia. You end up in the wine region, so you can do that and then fly out of Tbilisi, whatever your plans are. So that's the broad overview, is to start in Baku and then travel northwest overland.
Okay, got it. Excellent. Shall we get into more detail? You're starting us in the capital, in Baku.
Starting in Baku, and it's a really fascinating city. So if you look at a map, we're in the South Caucasus between the two mountain ranges, and Baku is right on the Caspian Sea. So it's located on a peninsula, Absheron Peninsula, and it juts out into the Caspian. And I discovered today that it's the lowest capital in the world, biggest city in the world as well that's below sea level. So it's a low city, it's really windy, it's really dry and dusty. It's like basically uninhabitable. And it's fascinating that a city ended up in this location in the first place. And people will tell you that as well. They have all sorts of problems with getting clean water and everything, the infrastructure into the city. But the reason the city is there, and why it's been there for a long time, but the reason it's still there and flourished, was because of the oil. So this part of the country is very rich in oil fields, and it was like a convenient location to build a city close to the oil fields. That's why it blossomed. Oil is like such a big part of the country's history, and it's definitely an interesting thing to tap into when you're there. So the country went through several big oil booms. The biggest one was, I think, in the start of the 20th century. At that time, Azerbaijan was producing half the world's oil, so it was huge. There's all these like fascinating... Yeah, I didn't know this either, but it was massive. It was massive, and all these like very large infrastructure projects took place. They built the longest pipeline in the world between Baku and Batumi in Georgia, and yeah, it's a really interesting part of the history, and I definitely recommend delving into that when you're in Baku, which I'll talk about in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the older part of Baku, because of course the city is much older than 1901. It goes back a long time, and where you can really experience this is in the old town. So there's a beautiful walled city. It's called the Esher Esher, which means the inner city. And this was always like the city within the city. It's like the oldest part of the city. It's all encased in a wall, and it has all the very old architecture and the oldest landmarks. And this is a UNESCO site. So this is where I would recommend starting with your discovery of Baku, because it's where it all begins. And it's a really beautiful area just to walk around, especially in the early morning. There's still a lot of families that live inside the old city. So you can see like these little vignettes of daily life, as well as these beautiful historic buildings, hammams, mosques. The centerpiece is a palace, and this was the Shivan Shah's Palace, and this was the dynasty that ruled Azerbaijan for a very long time. It was between 861 and 1538. So they had a huge impact on the country's formation and history. And this was where their palace was. This was where their center was. So learning a bit about them with a tour of the palace and looking at some of these landmarks is really a nice way to start your time in Baku.
Okay. Now, I was trying to remember anything about that family, and I associate Azerbaijan with Persia, as I know that Russia and Persia fought over it in the Russo-Persian War, but I can't see any connection from that family to Persia, so I don't know if I'm just making this up in my head.
I think there's a connection. Everywhere I see, they are referred to as an Arab-Persian dynasty. So There's definitely a connection, and I think you can see it in the architecture and in the design of some of these buildings as well, a Persian influence, definitely. Okay. So this old city, which is really nice to walk around, it backs onto the Caspian Sea. And this is also a really important part of the city. It frames the city and makes it what it is. So they have a huge boulevard that goes all the way along the seafront. It's called the Boulevard. And you can, just walk along there. And it's a really nice way to discover some of the quirkier landmarks of the city. So there's like a miniature Venice water park and some things that are a little bit naff, okay?
Wait.
Canals and little boats and little gondolas.
Okay.
Some people enjoy it, but it's just one of those quirky things. They also have the tallest flagpole in the world on this boulevard. So you'll see these things that are very grand, and they like to do these sort of big gestures, I think. It was bypassed by something else, but now they're building a new one. It's going to be the biggest again. So there's that. At the top of the boulevard are the flame towers. There's 3 buildings in this complex, and this is really an icon of Baku. And they're shaped like flames, like tapered at the top, and each one has a different sort of curvature. And there are certain points where you can stand in the old town and look through these really old buildings and see the 3 towers there. So a really nice juxtaposition between the old and the new. But you can get up close to these towers as well, and there's a really nice park that's set up on the hill. It's good to go at sunset, actually, because the views are beautiful of the sea and the lights coming on. So that's a really cool little thing to do.
Okay.
Another building I love in Baku, and this is another really famous spot, is called the Heydar Aliyev Center. It was designed by Zaha Hadid, the British-Iraqi architect. It was finished in 2012, so it's pretty new. It's just a gorgeous building. If you're into architecture, into photography, you can spend an hour or more just walking around this building. It's like a cultural center, so there are some exhibitions inside, but it's really the outside that's the most interesting part. I don't know exactly what it's supposed to resemble. There are lots of different theories, but it's this beautiful curvature that kind of melts into the earth, and then there are these old sort of buildings in the backdrop, and just as the sun hits it at different angles, it's really cool, and the facade is all glazed and white. You can stand at points, it looks like a big snowy mountain or something. It's crazy with people walking up the sides.
It looks to me like a 1960s City of the Future airport design.
Yes, it's a bit like that, with the big sort of windows like eyes. But It's really cool. I really enjoy that. Yeah, and then there are a couple of interesting museums in Baku as well. One worth mentioning is the Museum of Miniature Books. And apparently this is the only museum of miniature books in the world, and they just have lots of tiny books. So that's quirky.
When you say tiny books, are we talking a couple inches or...
Yeah, they range. The smallest one is tiny, and then you have your more standard miniature book.
Okay.
But all different kinds of, all different languages and religious books and everything else. Yeah, and I mentioned the oil history, so I really recommend doing something around this theme. And one of the things you can do is a tour of the mansions that the oil barons built at the turn of the century. So when all this money started flowing into Baku, and of course oil was privatized at that time, so you had a couple families who became very wealthy, and they built these incredible houses to display their wealth and just have a beautiful place to live. And you can do a walking tour that's themed around these residences and the beautiful architecture and the beautiful entryways. It's really worth doing as a sort of a gateway into the history as well, and to learn a bit about the history of these families and these individuals who had such a huge role in how Baku became a flourishing oil city as it was at that time. So a really great guide I can recommend, his name is Gani Nazarov. This is one of his specialty subjects, and he has a company that does walking tours that's definitely worth doing.
What is the name of the company?
Name is Azerbaijan Traveller, so very easy to remember.
Okay.
He's a terrific guide. Yeah, look, you can easily fill a couple of days in Baku. It's quite walkable. It's quite flat, obviously, because it's right down on the sea there, apart from these couple of hills. You can also take the metro to get around. They have a Soviet-era metro system, so some of the stations are very beautifully decorated. Not in the St. Petersburg style, but in a different way, but they're also beautiful in their own way. One thing, though, you can't take photos in the metro. They're very strict about this, so don't try and get your phone out, or you will be stopped, as I have discovered. But yeah, otherwise it's a nice city to walk around, and
That is true in many places in the world. I've been stopped in Victoria Station in London, so...
A couple of days in Baku is a nice introduction. Eat some local food. The national dish is plov, so like a rice pilaf dish. There are like hundreds of different variations. And on your second or third day, depending how much time you need, I would recommend doing a day trip. And there's one day trip that is very popular and for good reason, and it's to a place called Gobustan, which is south of Baku along the coast. And there are a couple of things in Gobustan that are very interesting. The first is the mud volcanoes. Azerbaijan has a lot of weird geological stuff, including, I don't know if it would be classed as geological, but as strange things happening in the earth, okay? A lot of strange things. One of them is mud volcanoes. There are like 350, ranging from massive ones to tiny ones that you can stand right over and look into. And they're formed by natural gas and oil and mud, and it's just oozing out of the ground. It's really strange and really interesting. So a huge concentration of them in this particular area. It's definitely popular, but they haven't really developed any infrastructure around it yet. So you still have to get out of the car or the tour bus on the highway. You get into a Lada, so like an old Soviet car, because that's just how they do it. And you're going along this road that is just so bumpy and just a very crazy road to get out to these mud volcanoes. And when you get there, there's 12 little white Ladas parked in this landscape that's just, it looks like you're on the moon. And of course, there's like a bunch of Ladas there. It's really funny. So one day they'll develop it, but for now it's this really cool little experience you can have. But yeah, in Gobustan there's also the petroglyphs. So there's 6,000 of these rock carvings from a period after the last ice age, and those are really interesting. This is also a UNESCO site, so very well set up with walking paths and a small museum. And then you can go to the fire temple, Ateshka, which has been used throughout time by different faiths, Hindus, Sikhs, Zoroastrians as well. And they call Azerbaijan the land of fire because of these strange things happening in the earth. And one of them is that these flames spontaneously erupt. So this is what happened on the site of this temple. A temple was built around it. And yeah, it was worshipped up until the 1880s. Now it's like a museum and a really interesting complex, a museum that you can walk around. And then there's one called Yanadag, which is literally means burning mountain. And for me, this was like kind of the coolest because it's just like a hillside on fire. And as they say, the story is that a shepherd was out with his sheep in the 1950s. He was smoking a cigarette and he threw the butt on the ground and the earth just caught fire. And this fire is still burning. It's fed by methane coming out of the ground and they can't extinguish it. So it's this very emblematic and spiritual place near Baku where people go, and they've built an amphitheater kind of thing around it, but it's just crazy.
I remember when we doing an episode about, I think it was Turkmenistan, someone said it's the only place that this fire exists, and I went, except for across the Caspian Sea in Azerbaijan. But
exactly. But I was there with a group, and someone in the group was very disappointed because he was picturing those gates of hell in, I think it's called, in Central Asia, but no, it's not as impressive, but it's still quirky.
Ah, bon chien. Bonjour, je suis Theo, a tour leader with Explore. And this is Punti. He's helping us find truffles under the trees next to this beautiful vineyard. Maybe for tomorrow's cooking class? We call it semi-heure. Parfait. 7:00. Not everyone gets to enjoy a Bordeaux sunset this way, but you will if you explore. No, Punti. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel. Explore.
And it seems like that would be a place you'd want to visit at night.
Yeah, at twilight is really nice. I don't know how late they open. Oh, they do open at night. Actually, they have this cool initiative now where they're doing live music at some of these historical sites, and Yanadag is one of them, where they have a live band playing. So that would be really cool to see it at night. Yeah, but even in the day, you can see the flames pretty clearly.
Okay.
So that would be a really nice way to spend 2 or 3 days in Baku. I would suggest 3 days, including your day trip. And then you can hit the road and start seeing, quote unquote, the real Azerbaijan outside of the city, because Baku is a very modern city and there's a lot more to the country than Baku, of course. If you want to go to a place called Nakhchivan, this would be the time to do it. Nakhchivan is an autonomous republic. It's not the disputed area I was talking about.
Okay.
It's a different area. It's part of Azerbaijan, but it is an enclave that's surrounded by Armenia, I think. So the only way to get there is to fly. So if you wanted to go there, you would fly from Baku. The flights are subsidized and it just takes under an hour. I haven't been there, but it looks pretty cool because they have this thing that they call the Machu Picchu of the Caucasus. It's called Alinjagala. It's a fortress that's set up on a ridge with a big mountain, and it is quite impressive. If you wanted to see that, you would do it now when you can fly to Baku.
Okay. I didn't know that any of this existed. And we've done an episode on the place before. Okay.
It's very cool. It looks very impressive.
Huh. Okay. Where to next?
Okay, if you're going to hit the road, there are different ways you can go, but I recommend going northwest. On its western side, Azerbaijan makes a fork with Georgia coming down in the middle. But if you stick to the northwest route, it's a very mountainous, beautiful region, very diverse and a very interesting history. So first of all, you should probably go to Kinalik. Kinalik is up there with the highest continuously inhabited villages in Europe, depending how you define Azerbaijan. It's a very high village community that they have this ritual of the transhumance where they winter down in the lower plains and then they bring their sheep back up the mountain for summer. So it's this really very old community with their own culture and their own language and a very beautiful mountain setting and feels very sheltered from the modern way of life in a way. They make their own cheese and all this kind of very interesting stuff. So if you're interested in doing a homestay, having a down-to-earth experience, there are lots of homestays in this village, Kinalik, and you can also do hiking. So this is a great place to hike. There are guides, or you can just meet people and set out for a short mountain hike by yourself. So it's about 4 hours drive from Baku. And a nice detour if you're into hiking or you want to have this sort of mountain village experience.
You said something a moment ago in terms of Europe. So I have always a hard time when I go to put Georgia on the map and categorize it in Amateur Traveler, we categorize it as Europe. When I go to Armenia, we categorize Europe. Now, of course, Turkey, just south of there, is not considered Europe. Azerbaijan, I honestly don't know what to put.
I don't know either. And it's a big debate. It's always a debate in these countries, are we Asia, are we Europe? And I think they're just something totally different and special.
Regionally, they're right next to each other. It's just that culturally, they're different. And that's what gets confusing. Yeah. But they're further east than Turkey, and most of Turkey we don't consider Europe, except for the left part of it. I just never know. I didn't know if it was everybody in the region go, oh yes, we know. It's very obvious, but no.
Yeah, it's funny. Georgia, definitely. Georgians are 100%. We are part of Europe. Azerbaijan, It's not as clear, and there's a great novel that explores this. It's called Ali and Nino, and I recommend reading it before you visit the region. Most of it is set in Baku, and it's a love story between a Azerbaijani boy and a girl from Georgia. And they explore these tensions between East and West and Europe and Asia in a very beautiful way, and really nice descriptions of the city as well. So it's a short novel by an author called Kurban Saeed, and they still don't know his real identity, I don't think. It's definitely worth reading. And in the book he says, yes, the three countries, we're European, we're Asiatic. He says we receive from the East and the West and we give back to both. And I think that's a really beautiful way of thinking of it.
Okay.
But it is very hard to pin down where exactly you are, especially when you're in a place like Baku where you're like, am I in Paris right now? The architecture is very European. And then a few hours later, you're in a not so Parisian feeling environment, but still very interesting.
Okay.
Maybe some hiking in the mountains. And then one place you can stop on the way to Kinalik is called Kuba. It's a small village, but the reason I recommend it is they have some great carpet workshops. So if you're interested in handicrafts and this sort of thing, one of the traditional, I think there are 7 schools of carpet weaving in Azerbaijan, and one of them is based in this region, Kuba. So you can stop there and visit one of the workshops, and they welcome you to come in and have a look at them making these phenomenal carpets that are just, there's 7 women working on the one carpet. They're just so big and very impressive. So if you do that as a little stop, then you have to come back through Baku almost before continuing northwest. But the next stop is called Lahich, and it's another mountain town. It's not far from Kinalik, but it's got the mountains in between, so you can't travel directly between the two. You have to come back around. But Lahich, it's about 3 hours from Baku via a very windy road, and until fairly recently it was completely cut off. This road is quite new. It's sealed and it's fine to drive now, which is good and bad. It has become quite touristy, but it's still a very popular place to visit. The main thing about Lahich is the copper workshops, and this is like a traditional craft for the village. It's a tiny place. There's one street just lined with these copper workshops where people exactly, tinkerers, yeah. Hammering plates and actually soldering stuff with big furnaces, and it's quite interesting actually. So yeah, you can visit these shops, and of course there's no safety protocol, so you can just walk up to the furnace and have a look at how it's all done. And that's quite fun. Buy something nice. And they do, yeah, beautiful plates and samovar, which is the traditional instrument thing, beautiful silver, huge thing used for making tea, which maybe I'll talk about more later, but tea is very important in Azerbaijani culture, and this is one place where you can buy. I don't know how you would carry this home, but if you want a samovar, that's a really nice place to buy one. Otherwise, you can get a small plate or something more manageable. But yeah, Lahich, I would just have a stop over there. I think it's enough to just walk around, maybe go to the small museum, and then you can continue. So you go deeper into the mountains. There's a place called Gabala. And in Gabala, there's a ski resort. It's obviously very mountainous, quite popular in winter, but they run the cable car all year. So I did it in spring, and although it was so foggy, I couldn't see anything. It was still a cool experience. The ski resort itself is very well set up. So if you're looking for a budget ski vacation, this would be somewhere to consider, as strange as it seems. The resort is called Tufandag, and yeah, it's becoming quite popular, I think. It's beautiful accommodations and very good facilities that they have. So if you're visiting in winter, that would be the place to go. They also have an airport. But if you're not visiting in winter, which most people don't, then yeah, you can just ride the cable car, have a short stopover, maybe have lunch. Down in the valley, there's a river, and very popular in this region is to go to these restaurants that are set on the river, and you have like fresh trout or river fish, and that's something you can do in Gabala as well. So that's a really nice place to just have a rest stop, basically. So then moving closer to Georgia again, and my favorite place in Azerbaijan for sure, it's a city called Sheki. So Sheki is, I think it's the 9th biggest city in Azerbaijan, so it's quite small. It's just a fantastic place to spend 2 or 3 days, or just have a couple of days to chill out. It's a beautiful city set in the mountains, and it has a really fascinating history. It was a really important stop on the Silk Road, so you have all those beautiful monuments from that period to just massive caravanserais on the main street, and they are the center of the city, and they define the whole layout of the city, and they are so impressive. One of them is closed for restoration. The other one is open, and it has a hotel inside, so you can go and stay there in the old traders' quarters, which are like these very stone curved cave-like little chambers. It's really cool. I stayed there in 2017. It's pretty basic, but they have heaters and bedding and ensuite bathrooms, of course. And yeah, it's a really cool experience, because you can just imagine.
Which they probably did not have.
I'm guessing they
back when
didn't.
the caravans were coming through.
Exactly. I'm guessing probably not. But yeah, it's pretty cool to picture yourself sleeping where potentially these traders traveling between Asia and Europe, plying this route, and in the center of the caravanserai there's this beautiful courtyard where I'm sure they would sit and have tea and strike deals and all sorts of things. And just the history is pretty amazing, and the fact that it's been so well preserved, and just the scale of it is astounding. There's like more than 1,000 rooms that they can potentially
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's massive. And then there's like stables, and there's also a tea house in there, and then on the bottom story they have all shops and workshops that have little businesses in them that you can visit. So they keep that sort of trading philosophy alive, still part of the fabric of the city. So yeah, that's really cool. But the thing that Sheki is really famous for is the Palace of the Sheki Khan. It was finished in 1797. It was built for the Khan, who was like the ruler of the region. So this is when you have that sort of Persian Arabic influence in Azerbaijan, and the country is like split up into these small Khanates. This particular Khan, he ruled from Sheki. It was like the capital, and this palace was built for him and his family. It took 10 years to build, and it's just one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen. It's incredible. They have preserved it really well. They've had local craftsmen who... Sheki is a UNESCO creative city. It's recognized for having these beautiful heritage crafts. A lot of this comes from the Silk Road time because they had materials coming through. They had their own silk industry as well. So they still have all these really skilled craftsmen in the city, and they are the ones who restored the palace and kept it in good nick. And it's in incredible condition, and so much of it is still original, which is amazing because the inside is just painted from ceiling to floor, beautiful Persian-like miniature paintings that each one is different, and hunting scenes and local flowers and fauna and all this symbolic stuff that once you start digging in, if you get a good guide for the palace, which the guides are generally really good, they'll tell you the meaning behind some of these paintings, and they're just incredible. And each human has a different face and a different expression because the artist wanted to do the best job he could for the Khan, and it's just so intricate. The inlay ceilings, and they also have this thing called shebeki glass, which is stained glass, and it's this special technique that was pioneered in Sheki, and they fit the glass together. It's in a wooden frame, but very ornate, and they don't use any nails or glue, and this is one of their specialty crafts in Sheki, and there are still people who make it today. So it's just really impressive. The light comes through the window, and all the glass is coloured, so it just makes this carpet like display on the floor, and the whole place is just so extra. It's beautiful.
And some people who are listening to you who have been to other Islamic countries, and the Khan was Islamic, would be surprised that there are pictures of people, because that's generally prohibited in many countries, and you'd get just the script from the Quran and geometric things. But Persia being one of those places where that was somehow a little different, and you can see some of that, for instance, in other places in Islamic countries. I think of in Istanbul, in some of the old palaces, there were also depictions of people.
A lot of human figures and a very realistic storytelling in these paintings. So that is very interesting.
I'm sure if we have some Islamic scholar, they can tell me why that's different, but I do not know.
I don't know either. All I know is that it is absolutely stunning, and you have to pay 5 manat, which is like not even $5, I don't think, to enter with a guide. Yeah, these guides are really super passionate. They have studied this place from top to toe, and to have that guided tour is awesome. And the whole complex, it's inside a fortress, so there are other palatial buildings, but there's also a lot of these brick buildings that came much later that were installed by the Russian Empire when they made it into a barracks. So now these buildings are being retrofitted and turned into galleries and museums and creative spaces. So this whole precinct is going to be a real sort of centerpiece of Sheki creativity, which is something that the city is really prides themselves on. And part of why this is happening now is that Sheki is a UNESCO site. It was inscribed, I think, in 2019, so fairly recently. Not just the palace, but there's more than 100 different monuments in the city itself, ranging from hammams to houses and all sorts of things. So the whole city is a big open-air museum. And it's just terrific to walk around and see all these different monuments. So yeah, I love traveling to places where you can just get lost and have your camera and just explore on foot, and Sheki is perfect for that. You go behind the castle into this old district, and yeah, it's just like winding streets and all this fabulous architecture. There's another palace that not everyone knows about. I guess more people know about it now, but it's a second palace that was hidden. There were people living inside until quite recently. I think the restoration's finished now, but it was done much later than the main palace. But yeah, another example of these miniature paintings in one of the rooms. It's more pared back because it was for the Khan's relatives, not for the Khan himself. So they only had one nice room. But yeah, it's very beautiful with this glass as well. There's old silk factories. It's just a really cool place to wander around. And people are very friendly. Sheki people are known for being good-humoured and welcoming. And as you walk these back streets, you'll definitely get to chat with people and have that experience as well. Yeah.
Excellent.
So yeah, definitely if you're into handicrafts, there's the silk stuff. They also make these beautiful silk scarves called kelagai, and you can go to one of these workshops where they are block printing the scarves and buy one. They're really gorgeous. Sheki's also really famous for its food. So they have a sweet called Sheki halva. It's more like a baklava, but it's specific to this city. And, you know, I had a driver once who brought me to Sheki, and he bought like 12 boxes of this stuff to take back to Baku because this is like the best of the best. These makers are like 4th, 5th generation confectioners making this stuff with like very secret recipes. And yeah, it's this very sweet, sticky baklava-like sweet that, yeah, you can only have so much of it, but it's very delicious. They also have great local cuisine. So the really famous dish is called piti, and it's served in a clay pot. It's cool because it's your appetizer and it's your main course at the same time, because there's this particular way of eating it where you tear up the bread and then you pour some liquid and you're mashing things and you're mixing this and mixing that, and there's this very particular ritual to eat this sheki dish. A good thing to try when you're in town, and there are some really nice restaurants as well.
Okay, and I'm seeing that it's mutton and vegetables with a bread covering. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, lots of lamb in Azerbaijan. No pork, of course, because it's Islamic. So lots of lamb, like slow-cooked lamb. They're really, a lot of the cuisine, I said plov was the main national dish. So a lot of rice, lots of lamb, and then lots of fruit and nuts and, dishes like that. And Sheki is in this more fertile region, so they have a lot of local produce. If you go to the local bazaar, that's a really cool experience as well, just to see. I was there in spring, and the fruit is, even by Georgia's pretty well known for its fruit and veg. At least when you live here, you see it's pretty amazing. And Azerbaijan was like, wow, a little bit further south, and just so much fruit, so many plums, sour plums, everything, beautiful stuff. So yeah, you have to eat a lot when you're in Sheki for sure. Another thing you can do is take a little side trip to another village called Kish, and Kish is known for having this church, temple. It has different names because it's a bit mysterious, but it's understood to be the oldest Caucasian Albanian temple in the region. And the Caucasian Albanians were like in the Azerbaijani, they were in this territory for a really long time, from the 1st century BC. There's this ancient tribe. Present day speakers of the Udi language say that they're descended from these Caucasian Albanians, but it's like still a little bit mysterious. And they built these beautiful temples that have a round shape. Kish, as I said, it was probably the oldest based on what they've discovered. They also unearthed all these burial sites around the temple and covered them with perspex, so you can see the graves of these Caucasian Albanians. They were really tall people, which is not typical of Azerbaijanis, so they were a very different type of people, and there are theories that they came from Scandinavia. They came from a Nordic country somehow to this territory, but it's all very mysterious and interesting. So it's interesting to hear the different theories and see these traces of history around the country. I think there's more than 100 of these Caucasian Albanian temples scattered around, a lot in this region particularly, and further north. But this one at Kish is very famous. It became a museum in, I think, 2001. And they have a nice exhibit about the broader culture of the Caucasian Albanians. And it's definitely worth taking a little side trip out there. It's just like 20 minutes from Sheki.
And the thought that Scandinavians or Vikings might not have come down to this region isn't crazy, because we know that the Vikings from Sweden had a huge influence on the history of Russia, including having many of the early Russian rulers descended from that group. And they definitely took their longboats all the way down into Istanbul, and they were in this region for sure. So might they have been related to that? Who knows? I cannot tell you.
Yeah, interesting. And in Gobustan, the petroglyphs, some of these petroglyphs show what looks to be like a Scandinavian longboat. So that's maybe supporting that theory. So yeah, very interesting.
I want to say, yes, there was the Varangian Guard for the Byzantine army that were personal bodyguards of who would have been Caesar, basically, or the ruler of Byzantium or of Eastern Rome, and they were Norsemen. They were from Scandinavia. Again, they had an influence in the region.
They certainly went far and wide. So yeah. A lot of people have investigated this, and yeah, it was actually the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that had a big role in protecting this temple and establishing the museum. So that's really nice as well. And it's very interesting to hear that this circular shape of the Caucasian Albanian architecture, it influenced the first mosques that were built in Azerbaijan. So you can see this design echoed in the Islamic architecture. So that's a really nice sort of through line as well. So again, a really important part of the history that you can get up close.
Interesting. Okay.
Sheki is your last stop before the Georgian border. There are more places you can see. There's Gak and Zagatala. There's also a really nice nature reserve near Gak. And again, a lot of this Caucasian Albanian history, hiking. There are some short hikes near Sheki. There's also a great project in this region called the Trans-Caucasian Trail, which their goal, I believe, is to map a continuous hike through the three countries, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And they are starting with mapping or plotting out these individual routes in the three countries. So there's one from Sheki to Zagatala, which goes further northwest into Azerbaijan.
Okay.
So that would be a really nice hike if you're interested in doing like a more long distance hike. I think they've started marking it now. It's not finished, I don't think. But you're right up in the foothills of the mountains or in the mountains now. So heaps of opportunities for hiking. If you're not into hiking, then yeah, I would spend time in Sheki. It's such a charming city. There's lots more to do. There's wine bars and all this great stuff. So you can easily have a few days there at a slow pace, and really nice if you can stay in the caravanserai. But when you're satisfied, it's very easy to leave Sheki and travel overland back into Georgia.
Got it. If we expanded, if you had a little more time in Azerbaijan, are there places that you would add on that you pruned from your itinerary just for time?
Yes, there's one place, and it would be, the thing is that you have to keep going back through Baku. You could sort of circle around, but there's a place in the south of the country, on the Caspian Sea, but in the very, very south, very close to the border with Iran. It's called Lankaran. And this is, again, a mountainous sort of area, very fertile. The thing here is the tea plantations. So in the Soviet era, they grew a lot of tea here. And some of these plantations are still going. And you can visit them. They're really interesting. As I said, tea is a huge part of Azerbaijani culture. They produce quite a lot of tea, and most of it is consumed domestically because they drink a lot of tea in Azerbaijan.
Well, and you say it's a big part of the culture, different from the other places in the region?
I think so. Georgia has an old tea history as well, but it's not really part of the day-to-day.
I'm thinking more south of there, where you go to Turkey, for instance, has a big tea culture also.
Yeah, it would be very similar to Turkey, because Azerbaijan, they're Turkic ancestry, so a very close connection to Turkish culture. I would say it's similar. One interesting thing that someone told me is that the tea glasses that you drink from in Azerbaijan are like double the size of the ones in Turkey. And I was like, why are they different? And they said, well, you can fit more tea into a bigger glass. So I liked that. They're just like a bigger version.
So yeah.
Yeah. These ones are big. They last a bit longer. But yeah, it's sitting down and having the samovar and drinking the tea, that whole ritual of the water and the tea and everything. And then in Azerbaijan, it's very traditional to have jam with your tea. So I've never had jam this way. It's not on bread or anything like that. You just have it in a little ramekin that you have for yourself, and you just eat it with a teaspoon, and you put some in your mouth. It's obviously very sweet, and then you drink the tea through the jam. So it's like the sugar thing in Turkey, except it's like a fruity jam made with cherry or something. So that's quite unusual, I think, for Azerbaijan as well.
Interesting. As we start to wrap this up, anything else people should know before they go to Azerbaijan?
Yeah, I mentioned about getting in for the moment until October, probably. You have to fly. You also need a visa.
October 2023 is when we're recording this, just for those who are listening far in the future. Yep, okay.
That's right. Another thing is that you need a visa. So unlike Georgia, Armenia, for most people, you do need a visa. You can get an e-visa. It costs $25, but yeah, you have to apply for that in advance online. Yeah, it's a lot of people speak English. It's a very sort of easy country to travel in that way. There's good transportation, there's domestic trains, there's also marshrutkas and buses, so it is pretty easy to get around. I think it would be fine to hire a car as well if you wanted to do something a bit adventurous. And I would say I've been most recently in spring, but a really nice time to visit is in autumn. In October especially, there are lots of festivals. There's a pomegranate festival, a pumpkin festival, a tea festival, and a whole bunch of other things going on. So I think the month of October or autumn in general, when the colours are changing and there's great produce, that would be a really nice time to visit.
And then the term you use there, marshrukas, we've talked about before on the show, but for those who are not familiar with this region, that would be the small, not quite a minivan, but the small van quite filled with people that you're taking as part of public transportation.
Quite filled, yes. Exactly. Fixed route minivans, so they go from A to B, but you can get off anywhere you like along the way. And yes, you might be sitting next to a box of apples, or you might have a bag of rice on your lap. You never quite know what will happen in a marshrutka, but they are quite fun. In Azerbaijan, they also have big proper coach buses as well. So if you prefer to have some legroom, you can do that. For most of these destinations, they do have buses as well.
Excellent. As we go to wrap this up, you are standing in the prettiest spot in Azerbaijan. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
Oh, I have to say in Baku, because Baku is just a city, like a crazy city. For me, it's beautiful. The contrast between old and new is beautiful. And there's this, I mentioned this one spot where you stand in the old town and you can see the flame towers. That is gorgeous. Another place is the Highland Park, which is above the city, and you go up here at sunset, you look out at the lights coming on, and the Caspian just has this perfect curve in this one spot. And yeah, it's just an amazing view. I love that place.
Excellent. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Azerbaijan.
There's a lot of things. One thing, I talked about tea, but a really interesting thing is this culture of the tea house, the chaikhana. And this is a place that's very mysterious to me because women are allowed in there, but it's not really a done thing. Even today, this is like the men's domain. So this is a very interesting quirk of Azerbaijan that maybe if you're a male traveler, you get to experience this culture in a different way. Yeah, but another thing, only in Azerbaijan you would see these very modern buildings, these multi-million-dollar, huge state-of-the-art architecture, and a Lada rolling past, because as Azerbaijanis have told me, people just prefer the Lada. They're just a more reliable vehicle. People still love to purchase them. You see them everywhere, way more than in Georgia. In all colors of the rainbow, these lovely little Ladas rolling down the streets of Baku.
Interesting. And are they still making Ladas? I thought they stopped, but maybe I'm wrong.
I don't think they make them. They're just a very fertile secondhand market for Ladas. Okay. If you have a good one, you got to hang on to it.
They were at least making them until 2010, I'm seeing. Maybe they still are making newer designs of Ladas. I do not know.
They still make the Niva. I know they make the Niva, the little hatchback one. The little old ones that are low to the ground. Those ones are very clean.
And do they, like some of the old East German cars, produce a cloud of smoke behind them as they go down the road? Or
often, yeah. That's definitely something.
Excellent. If you had to summarize Azerbaijan in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Okay. Definitely tea, because you can't escape it. It's such an important part of the culture. Fire, of course, because it's a symbol, it's an emblem, it's in so many different things that you see all around the place. And this fire worshipping is such an interesting part of the history. And oil, of course, because it really is a nation built on oil. And still today, such a fascinating piece of identity of the country. And yeah, the oil history for me is fascinating.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Emily Lush from wander-lush.org. And Emily, if we wanted to send people to your best post on Azerbaijan at Wanderlush, where are we going to send them to?
I think you should visit my guide to Sheki, which I am updating as we speak and will be newly revised by the time you hear this. But I do love Sheki. I think it's a really special place. And I've written up a pretty extensive guide to all the things you can see and do there. And yes, I hope it will convince you to not go as a day trip, but to spend some time in northern Azerbaijan. It's a really beautiful part of the country.
Excellent. And thank you so much for coming back on Amateur Traveler, and sharing with us your love for Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for having me.
Special thanks, as always, to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. You certainly are not required to, but if you're interested in supporting the show, you can go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler to learn more. I heard recently from Dana, who said, I've been listening to your podcasts for nearly 2 years now, and I can't tell you how much your podcasts have helped us in our trip planning. I feel so much more prepared now when planning our trips, and it has even inspired me to check out places I would likely never have before, such as Iowa, which we were planning a trip to last year. We live near Omaha. We are also planning a trip to Scotland and back to Utah to visit the last 3 national parks, and I've listened to your podcasts over and over to help plan the trip. I'm not sure how to leave a review, so I wanted to reach out. If you can give instructions on how to leave a review, I'd love to do that. Thanks again, Dana. And I want to read Dana's email in part because of that review question. Wherever you listen to your podcast is probably the best place to leave a review, whether it's Stitcher or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get them. There probably is a review feature. If you don't have a particular place, if you're listening to them on the website, for instance, then probably the thing that helps me most would be Apple Podcasts, just because that's the place that more people listen to than anywhere else. And I think you can do that from either the mobile app or from, I didn't see a way to do it on the web app, but you might be able to do it from Apple Music if you have that as a possibility. But again, of course, if you're not on Apple, if you're listening to on something else, wherever you're listening is probably the best place. And thanks so much, Dana, for asking. Speaking of asking questions, I sent out a question on the Amateur Traveler Facebook group. That's facebook.com/amateurtraveler about chapters of the show. And I do this periodically, probably every couple of years, because there are, some of you know this, many of you know this, and many of you don't, there are chapters in this show. So if you're listening on one of the podcast players that supports chapters, you get to see pictures of everything we're talking about, and then there's links off to various topics, because I link to everything and give credit for the photos and all that sort of things in the chapters. And I was asking how many people still use the chapters, because it costs me money to do it, because it affects the advertising opportunities. I can't put ads in the show for the first month, for instance, inserted ads. And then it also costs me at least a couple hours every week. And so I'm still looking to see whether people are using the chapters. And so if you're interested, they're in there. A couple of people are telling me that they use it on Apple CarPlay, that as they're going down the road, they have the chapters. Just keep your eyes on the road. That's all I would ask. And then I found out that it actually works on Apple TV as well, from the podcast app. You can see the chapters there as well. If you have a trick for how you're using the chapters and how you're seeing those pictures, let me know so I can share it with the community. Because, for instance, I don't know of a good app that uses the chapters on Android phones, and if you have one of those, please let me know. I'm off to Belize, so we're going to do a repeat show next week. I'm not sure which one just yet. And then also there's still space on the trip next year to Morocco if you're interested in that. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.